July 14, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy, France. A modified Sherman tank roared toward a wall of vegetation that had stopped the Allied advance for 5 weeks. The hedgerow ahead was 12 feet high, 4 feet thick at its base, an ancient earthen embankment crowned with centuries of tangled roots, bushes, and trees. Behind it, German machine gunners waited, knowing exactly what would happen when the American tank tried to climb over. They had seen it dozens of times before. The Sherman would tilt upward as it climbed the embankment, exposing its thin belly armor to German anti-tank weapons. The tank would be vulnerable for several seconds, plenty of time for a Panzerfaust rocket or an 88mm gun to punch through and kill the crew. Or the tank would get stuck on top of the hedge, balanced helplessly while German infantry closed in with magnetic mines and grenades. Either way, the Americans would lose another tank. The Germans had destroyed hundreds of Shermans this way since the invasion began. The bocage country of Normandy, with its endless maze of small fields surrounded by ancient hedgerows, had become a killing ground where American armor advantages meant nothing, and German defenders controlled every approach. But this Sherman was different. Welded to its front were 4 steel prongs that looked like the tusks of some mechanical beast. They were crude, made from German beach obstacles cut apart with blowtorches and welded together by mechanics who had no engineering training. The design was simple, almost primitive, but it was about to change the course of the Normandy campaign. The tank didn't slow down as it approached the hedgerow. The steel prongs hit the embankment first, driving into the earth like giant knives. The tank's treads churned, pushing forward with full power. The prongs tore through roots and soil, ripping the hedgerow apart from within rather than climbing over it. The German machine gunners watched in shock as the Sherman burst through the supposedly impenetrable barrier at full speed, emerging into their field with its guns level and ready to fire. The tank's belly had never been exposed. It hadn't gotten stuck. It had simply demolished the hedgerow and kept moving. Within seconds, the Sherman's 75mm gun and machine guns opened fire, destroying the German positions before they could react. Other modified Shermans followed through the breach, spreading out across the field, advancing in ways that had been impossible for 5 weeks. The Germans didn't understand what they were seeing. The hedgerows that had stopped the American advance for over a month were suddenly no longer obstacles. The Americans were breaking through everywhere, moving fast, exploiting breakthroughs before German forces could respond. In the command bunker, a German officer received frantic reports of American tanks breaking through hedgerows across the entire front. He couldn't believe it. The bocage had been their greatest defensive advantage. The terrain feature that allowed a few German defenders to stop entire American divisions. Now, somehow, it had become irrelevant. "What happened?" he demanded. "How are they doing this?" The answer came back from multiple positions. The American tanks have been modified. They have steel devices on the front that tear through the hedgerows. We cannot stop them. The device that had transformed the Normandy battlefield, that had broken the stalemate and allowed the Allied advance to resume, that would help liberate France and defeat Nazi Germany, had been invented 6 weeks earlier by a sergeant from New York. A 29-year-old cab driver named Curtis Culin, who had no engineering training, no technical education, no background in military innovation. Just a practical mind, a welding torch, and the determination to solve a problem that was getting American soldiers killed. This is the story of how Sergeant Curtis Culin invented the weapon that saved D-Day, how a simple device made from scrap metal changed the course of World War II, and how an ordinary soldier outsmarted the generals and proved that the best innovations often come from the men who have to live with the consequences of bad solutions. The Normandy invasion, Operation Overlord, had been years in the planning. Allied commanders knew the invasion would be the most complex military operation in history. They studied every aspect of the landing, planned for every contingency, created specialized equipment to overcome the obstacles they expected to face on the beaches. But they had missed something critical that would cost thousands of American lives and nearly derail the entire campaign. They had failed to understand the bocage. The bocage is unique to Normandy, a landscape created over centuries by Norman farmers who divided their land into small fields surrounded by hedgerows. But these weren't the neat, trimmed hedges familiar to English or American eyes. These were massive earthen embankments, 4 to 6 feet high and equally thick at the base, topped with centuries of accumulated vegetation, roots, bushes, and trees that added another 6 to 10 feet of height. The hedgerows had been built originally as property boundaries and livestock barriers. Norman farmers would pile up earth along the edges of their fields, creating embankments. Over decades and centuries, vegetation would grow on these embankments, roots would intertwine and strengthen them, and the hedgerows would become nearly solid walls of earth, roots, and plant matter. By 1944, some of the hedgerows in Normandy were hundreds of years old. Their earthen bases had been compacted and strengthened by centuries of weight. Their root systems were so dense and tangled that they formed a matrix stronger than concrete. They were, in effect, natural fortifications that made perfect defensive positions. The Allied planners knew the bocage existed. It appeared on maps and in aerial reconnaissance photographs. But viewing hedgerows from above, from aircraft or in photographs, didn't convey their actual physical properties. They looked like neat lines dividing fields, like decorative landscape features rather than military obstacles. The planners assumed tanks could simply push through hedgerows or drive around them. They didn't realize that the bocage created a maze of small fields, each one a potential killing ground, connected by narrow lanes that channeled movement and made flanking maneuvers almost impossible. They didn't understand that hedgerows weren't obstacles to be bypassed, but barriers that had to be breached, and that breaching them would be extraordinarily difficult. This failure of intelligence and imagination would cost the Allies dearly. When American forces landed on Omaha and Utah beaches on June 6, 1944, they faced fierce German resistance, but ultimately secured the beachheads. The initial objectives were achieved. Troops and equipment poured ashore. The invasion succeeded in its immediate goal of establishing a foothold in France. But then came the advance inland, and the Americans discovered the bocage. The landscape that had looked manageable on maps and in aerial photos turned out to be a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. The small fields, each surrounded by impenetrable hedgerows, became individual fortresses. German defenders could position machine guns and anti-tank weapons in the corners of fields with perfect fields of fire across the open ground. Attackers had to cross open fields under fire, then somehow get through the hedgerows to reach the next field where the process would repeat. Tank support, which American infantry relied on heavily, was nearly useless in the bocage. Sherman tanks couldn't push through the hedgerows. They were too solid, too deeply rooted. Tanks couldn't go around them. The fields were too small and the lanes too narrow. When tanks tried to climb over hedgerows, they would tilt upward, exposing their thin belly armor to German anti-tank weapons, positioned to exploit exactly this vulnerability. American commanders watched in frustration as their armored advantages evaporated in the bocage. The Sherman tank, which had been effective in North Africa and Italy, became a liability in Normandy. German defenders developed simple, effective tactics. Let the Shermans try to climb the hedgerows, then hit them in the belly with Panzerfaust rockets or anti-tank guns. The Americans lost hundreds of tanks this way in the first weeks after D-Day. The infantry suffered even worse. Advancing through the bocage meant attacking across open fields under machine gun fire, reaching hedgerows that provided cover, but also trapped soldiers in small areas where German artillery and mortars could target them, then trying to break through to the next field to repeat the entire deadly process. Casualties were horrific. American divisions that had landed in France at full strength were losing hundreds of men per day, gaining sometimes only a few hundred yards for dozens of casualties. By early July 1944, the Allied advance had stalled. American forces had penetrated only a few miles inland from the beaches. The great breakout that was supposed to follow the invasion hadn't happened. Instead, the Allies were bogged down in a grinding attritional battle in the bocage, losing men and tanks to German defenders who used the terrain masterfully. General Omar Bradley, commanding American ground forces in Normandy, was deeply worried. The Allies were winning the battle. German casualties were heavy too, but the pace of advance was far too slow. The Germans were rushing reinforcements to Normandy. If the Allies couldn't break out of the bocage soon, the campaign might bog down into static warfare reminiscent of World War I trenches. Bradley's staff studied the problem. Engineers proposed using explosives to demolish hedgerows before tank advances. This worked, but was time-consuming and dangerous. Engineers had to work exposed in fields under German fire, and the noise alerted German defenders to coming attacks. Bulldozers were tried, but were too slow and vulnerable, and there weren't enough of them. Some units tried using artillery to blast gaps in hedgerows, but this consumed enormous amounts of ammunition, and the results were inconsistent. The Army's Ordnance Department, responsible for weapons and equipment, was asked to develop a solution. They studied the problem and proposed several designs for hedge-cutting devices that could be mounted on tanks. These were engineered carefully, with precise specifications and proper metallurgy. Prototypes were built in England and shipped to Normandy for testing. The engineered solutions didn't work well. They were too heavy, affecting tank performance. They were complex, difficult to install and maintain. Most critically, they didn't actually solve the problem effectively. The hedgerows were tougher than the engineers had anticipated, and their carefully designed cutters often failed to penetrate the dense root systems. As July progressed, with the Allied advance still stalled and casualties mounting, the pressure to find a solution intensified. Senior officers demanded answers. Why couldn't American industry and engineering, which had produced the weapons and equipment that were winning the war, solve this relatively simple problem? But the engineers were stumped. The bocage was defeating sophisticated analysis and careful design. The solution, when it came, didn't come from engineers or officers or the Ordnance Department. It came from a sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division who drove a cab in New York before the war and who had spent enough time in Normandy to understand exactly what was needed. Curtis G. Culin, Jr. was born in 1915 in Cranford, New Jersey, though his family moved to New York when he was young. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood, attended public schools, and after graduating went to work as a taxi driver in New York City. Driving a cab in 1930s New York required practical intelligence, the ability to solve problems quickly, to navigate complex situations, to think on your feet. Culin wasn't college-educated, had no technical training, no engineering background. He was just an ordinary young man making a living in a tough city during the Depression. When war came, he did what millions of other young Americans did. He enlisted. He joined the Army in 1941, was assigned to the 2nd Armored Division, and trained as a tanker. By June 1944, Culin was a 29-year-old sergeant, a tank commander in the 2nd Armored Division preparing for the invasion of France. He had been in the Army for 3 years, had trained extensively in tank operations and tactics, and was as ready as anyone could be for combat. The 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, landed in Normandy on June 9th, 3 days after D-Day. They moved inland and immediately encountered the bocage. Culin, like every other American soldier in Normandy, learned quickly that the hedgerows were a much bigger problem than anyone had anticipated. He watched tanks from his division try to push through hedgerows and fail. He saw tanks try to climb over and get stuck or expose their bellies to German fire. He watched as American tanks became targets rather than weapons, as the armored advantage that was supposed to support infantry advances became a liability. Culin was a tanker. He understood tanks, knew their capabilities and limitations. He also had the practical mindset of someone who had spent years solving everyday problems, finding routes through New York traffic, figuring out how to get passengers where they needed to go despite obstacles. His mind worked practically, not theoretically. When faced with a problem, he thought about what would actually work rather than what should work according to principles. Looking at the bocage problem, Culin saw it simply. Tanks couldn't push through hedgerows because the hedgerows were too solid, too well-rooted. Tanks couldn't climb over hedgerows without exposing their bellies. Therefore, tanks needed a way to cut through hedgerows at ground level, tearing through the root system and embankment without climbing. The concept was simple. Instead of pushing or climbing, the tank should cut, like a plow through soil or a saw through wood. The tank had plenty of power. Sherman tanks had excellent engines and transmission. What they lacked was a cutting edge that could penetrate and tear through the dense roots and compacted earth of the hedgerows. Culin started thinking about what materials were available and how they could be used. In late June 1944, walking along the beaches where the invasion had occurred weeks earlier, Culin saw something that gave him an idea. The Germans had installed thousands of steel obstacles on the beaches, designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft or block their approach. These obstacles, called Belgian gates or Czech hedgehogs, were made of heavy steel beams welded or bolted together. After the invasion, these obstacles were being cleared from the beaches, cut apart with torches and moved to salvage piles. Thousands of tons of heavy steel, already cut into manageable pieces, just sitting there, waiting to be recycled or scrapped. Culin looked at the steel beach obstacles and saw raw material for his hedgerow cutter. The steel was heavy-duty, designed to stop landing craft, which meant it was strong enough to withstand the forces involved in ripping through hedgerows. The pieces were already cut to manageable sizes, and there were thousands of tons available, enough to modify every tank in Normandy if needed. He sketched out a design. It was crude, more concept than detailed engineering. Take 4 or 6 pieces of the beach obstacle steel, weld them to the front of a Sherman tank, angled forward and downward like tusks or prongs. When the tank drove forward into a hedgerow, these steel prongs would penetrate into the embankment, driven by the tank's weight and engine power. As the tank continued forward, the prongs would rip through the root system and tear the hedgerow apart from within, creating a gap the tank could drive through while keeping its hull level and its belly armor protected. It was simple, almost crude. It didn't require precision engineering or special materials. Any mechanic with a welding torch could build it, and it would work. Culin was sure of it, because it addressed the actual problem rather than trying to push through or climb over the hedgerow. It would rip the hedgerow apart. Culin took his idea to his company commander in early July 1944. He explained the concept, showed his sketches, and asked for permission to build a prototype. His commander was skeptical. The Army's Ordnance Department was working on official solutions. Why should a sergeant's improvised device be any better? But he gave Culin permission to try. If it worked, great. If it didn't, they hadn't lost much beyond some scrap steel and a few hours of work. Culin gathered materials. He went to the beaches, selected pieces of German steel obstacles that looked right for his purpose, had them cut to appropriate lengths. He found a maintenance area with welding equipment, and over the course of several days in early July, working with mechanics from his unit, Culin built the first hedgerow cutter. The device was simple: 4 steel prongs, each about 5 feet long, made from beach obstacle steel, welded to a mounting bracket that was then welded to the front of a Sherman tank. The prongs angled forward and slightly downward, like the business end of a plow or the tusks of a wild boar. The entire assembly weighed perhaps 500 pounds, heavy but not enough to significantly affect the Sherman's performance. The welding was crude. These weren't master craftsmen building precision equipment. They were tank mechanics doing field-expedient modifications, making it strong. Enough to work, not worrying about appearance or elegance. When they finished, the modified Sherman looked odd, almost comical, like it had grown steel tusks. But appearance didn't matter. What mattered was whether it would work. Culin and his crew took the modified tank to an area with typical Norman hedgerows and prepared to test it. Other soldiers gathered to watch, curious but skeptical. The Army had been trying to solve the hedgerow problem for weeks without success. What made this sergeant think his improvised device would work when proper engineering had failed? Culin climbed into the commander's position. The driver started the engine. Culin selected a hedgerow that was typical of those that had been stopping American advances, about 12 feet high, thick with vegetation, with a solid earthen base reinforced by centuries of root growth. He gave the order. The Sherman accelerated toward the hedgerow at full speed. The steel prongs hit the embankment first, driving into the earth with the full force of 30 tons of tank pushing behind them. The prongs penetrated deep, like knives into flesh. The tank's treads churned, driving the prongs deeper, forcing them through the compacted soil and tangled roots. For a moment, it seemed the hedgerow might hold. The tank's forward progress slowed as it pushed against centuries of accumulated root and earth. Then, something gave. The root system tore. The earth split. The hedgerow began coming apart from within, ripped open by the steel prongs forcing their way through. The Sherman burst through the hedgerow in seconds, emerging on the other side with its hull level, its guns ready, moving at speed. The hedgerow that would have stopped or trapped any normal Sherman had been torn apart as if it were made of paper. The soldiers watching erupted in cheers. They had just seen the impossible. A Sherman tank had broken through a Norman hedgerow without exposing its belly, without getting stuck, without even slowing down significantly. The blowtorch, which had stopped the Allied advance for 5 weeks, had just become obsolete. Culin's device worked exactly as he had envisioned. The steel prongs, driven by the Sherman's weight and power, tore through hedgerows that had seemed impenetrable. Better yet, the device was simple enough that any maintenance unit could build it, used materials that were readily available, and could be installed on any Sherman tank in a few hours. Word of the successful test spread rapidly through the 2nd Armored Division. Culin demonstrated the device for senior officers, who watched in amazement as Sherman tanks equipped with his cutters smashed through hedgerows with ease. Tank commanders who had been losing crews to hedgerow fighting immediately wanted the device on their tanks. Mechanics started building more cutters, using Culin's design, welding them onto Shermans throughout the division. But getting the device officially approved and distributed to all American forces in Normandy would prove almost as difficult as inventing it had been. The Army had procedures, protocols, chains of command. An improvised device invented by a sergeant didn't fit into established systems for weapons development and deployment. Culin's cutter would have to overcome institutional inertia and bureaucratic resistance before it could reach the thousands of tanks that needed it. This is where the story becomes as much about military bureaucracy as about mechanical innovation. Culin had solved the technical problem. Now, someone had to solve the organizational problem of getting his solution implemented across an entire army. The success of Culin's hedgerow cutter in the 2nd Armored Division created an immediate problem for the Army's command structure. Here was a device that solved a critical tactical problem, a device that worked better than anything the Ordnance Department had developed, a device that was already being built and installed by mechanics in the field. But it had been invented by a sergeant, not by engineers. It hadn't gone through proper testing and approval processes. It wasn't an official Army solution. This created a dilemma for senior officers. On one hand, they desperately needed a solution to the hedgerow problem. The blowtorch was still stalling the Allied advance, American casualties were still mounting, and pressure from the highest levels of command to break the stalemate was intense. On the other hand, the Army had procedures and hierarchies. Weapons and equipment were supposed to be developed by qualified engineers through established processes, not improvised in the field by enlisted men. Some officers in the chain of command were enthusiastic about Culin's invention. They had seen it work, understood its potential, and wanted it distributed immediately to every tank in Normandy. But others were more cautious or outright skeptical. The Ordnance Department in particular was uncomfortable with a field expedient device that bypassed their entire development and testing process. The debate over the Culin hedgerow cutter revealed tensions that existed throughout the American military during World War II. The tension between formal engineering and practical improvisation, between doing things by the book and doing whatever worked, between respecting the chain of command and empowering soldiers to solve problems themselves. Fortunately for the Allied cause, the officers who recognized the cutter's value outranked those who wanted to follow procedure. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, heard about the device in mid-July and demanded a demonstration. Bradley was under enormous pressure. The Normandy campaign was behind schedule, casualties were heavy, and Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower was pushing for faster progress. Bradley watched as a Sherman equipped with Culin's cutter demolished hedgerows that had been stopping American advances for 6 weeks. He immediately understood the implications. This simple device could break the stalemate, could allow American armor to operate effectively in the blowtorch, could restore mobility to a campaign that had become static and attritional. Bradley's response was decisive and characteristic of his leadership style. He didn't care that the device had been invented by a sergeant rather than an engineer. He didn't care that it hadn't gone through official approval processes. It worked, it was needed immediately, and he was going to make sure every tank under his command got one. Bradley issued orders that the hedgerow cutter was to be manufactured and installed on every Sherman tank in Normandy as quickly as possible. He didn't ask the Ordnance Department for approval, he told them to make it happen. The device was to be produced using whatever materials were available and whatever manufacturing capacity existed in the theater. Speed was more important than elegance or following proper procedures. The Army's ordnance and maintenance units swung into action. The beaches of Normandy still had thousands of tons of German steel obstacles waiting to be cleared. These became the primary raw material for hedgerow cutters. Maintenance units were given Culin's basic design and told to start building cutters and installing them on tanks. The design was intentionally kept simple so that any competent mechanic could build it without special training or tools. This meant there was variation in the cutters being produced. Some were 4-pronged, some had 6 prongs, some used heavier steel, some lighter, but they all worked on the same principle: steel prongs that penetrated and tore through hedgerows rather than trying to push through or climb over. The manufacturing effort was enormous. Thousands of cutters needed to be built. Steel had to be cut, shaped, and welded. Mounting brackets had to be fabricated to attach the cutters to Sherman tanks. Each installation took several hours of work by a team of mechanics, and all of this had to happen while the campaign was ongoing, with maintenance units trying to keep tanks running and repair battle damage while simultaneously modifying every tank in the theater. But the American military's logistical capabilities, which were perhaps its greatest strength, proved equal to the challenge. Maintenance battalions set up assembly lines, producing cutters in standardized batches. Mobile welding teams moved between units, installing cutters on tanks. Materials were transported from the beaches to maintenance areas. Within 2 weeks of Bradley's order, hundreds of Sherman tanks had been equipped with hedgerow cutters. Within a month, nearly every Sherman in Normandy had one. The speed of this transformation was remarkable and spoke to American organizational and industrial capabilities. From the successful test of Culin's first prototype in early July to widespread deployment across the entire Army by early August was less than 6 weeks. The Army had taken a field expedient, invention by a sergeant, and scaled it to thousands of tanks through improvised manufacturing and installation, all while fighting a major campaign. The modified tanks were nicknamed rhino tanks because the steel prongs looked like rhinoceros horns. The name stuck and became standard terminology. A rhino tank was a Sherman equipped with a Culin hedgerow cutter, a tank that could break through the bulkage that had stopped earlier models. But having the technology was only the first step. Tank crews and infantry units had to learn how to use rhino tanks effectively, had to develop new tactics that exploited the breakthrough capability the cutters provided. This required training, experimentation, and the rapid dissemination of lessons learned. American tank commanders quickly discovered that the rhino tanks changed the tactical equation fundamentally. Instead of being forced to use narrow lanes that German defenders could cover with anti-tank weapons, rhinos could break through hedgerows anywhere, creating new routes of advance that Germans couldn't anticipate or defend effectively. Instead of having to climb over hedgerows and expose belly armor, rhinos could burst through at full speed with guns level and ready to fire, maintaining the initiative and keeping German defenders on the defensive. Instead of getting channeled into killing zones, American armor could now maneuver freely, using the same terrain features that had favored defenders to instead support offensive operations. The tactical implications were profound. Before rhino tanks, American advances in the bocage followed predictable patterns. Infantry would attack across open fields, take heavy casualties, eventually seize the next hedgerow, then repeat the process. Tanks would try to support through lanes or by climbing hedgerows, often getting destroyed in the process. Progress was slow, costly, and tactically predictable. With rhino tanks, American forces could conduct combined arms operations properly. Tanks could lead advances, breaking through hedgerows rapidly and suppressing German positions with direct fire. Infantry could follow closely behind, using the gaps created by tanks to advance under cover. Artillery could support with precision because the battles were more mobile and fluid rather than static. Most importantly, Rhino tanks restored the initiative to American forces. German defenders had controlled the tempo of operations in the bocage because the terrain favored defense so heavily. Attackers had to come through predictable routes at predictable times. Defenders could prepare positions, pre-register artillery, and wait for Americans to walk into killing zones. Rhino tanks broke this pattern. Americans could now attack anywhere, through any hedgerow, at any time. German defenders couldn't predict where breakthroughs would occur. They couldn't prepare every possible position. They lost the defensive advantage that the bocage had provided. The tactical revolution created by Rhino tanks can be seen clearly in operational reports from late July and early August 1944. Units that had been advancing a few hundred yards per day while taking heavy casualties suddenly started making advances of miles per day with reduced casualties. German defensive positions that would have taken days to reduce were being overrun in hours. The entire character of the Normandy campaign changed. One tank commander, Captain James Byrd of the 2nd Armored Division, described the difference in a letter home. Before the Rhinos, we were sitting ducks. We'd try to get through the hedgerows and the Germans would be waiting. We lost tanks every day, lost good men, and felt like we were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. The bocage was killing us. Then we got the cutters, and suddenly we were mobile again. We could go anywhere, hit the Germans from unexpected angles, keep them off balance. It was like someone had removed the chains. We went from being targets to being hunters. The German perspective on Rhino tanks was one of shock and dismay. German commanders had built their entire defensive strategy in Normandy around the bocage. They had carefully positioned their limited forces to take maximum advantage of the terrain. They had trained their troops in hedgerow fighting tactics. They had convinced themselves that they could hold Normandy indefinitely because the Americans couldn't overcome the bocage. The sudden appearance of Rhino tanks destroyed these assumptions overnight. German defensive positions that had been considered secure were suddenly vulnerable. The terrain advantage they had relied on evaporated. The Americans were breaking through hedgerows at will, advancing faster than German forces could retreat or reposition. German after-action reports from this period reveal confusion and concern. One report from the 352nd Infantry Division stated, "The Americans have modified their tanks with steel cutting devices that allow them to penetrate the bocage. Our defensive positions, which were previously effective, are now being overrun rapidly. The enemy can advance through terrain we considered impassable to armor. We cannot hold current positions without significant reinforcement." Another report from Panzer Lehr Division noted, "American armor is no longer restricted to roads and lanes. They break through hedgerows anywhere along our front. This makes defensive planning nearly impossible. We cannot predict their axis of advance or concentrate forces effectively." The tactical situation has deteriorated significantly. The German High Command understood what was happening. The Americans had solved the bocage problem. The defensive advantage that had been expected to last months had been neutralized in weeks. This changed German strategic calculations about the entire Normandy campaign. Hitler had ordered German forces to hold Normandy at all costs, to fight for every field and hedgerow, to make the Americans pay such a high price for every yard of advance that they would lose the will to continue. This strategy had seemed viable when the bocage was stopping American advances. But with Rhino tanks breaking the stalemate, holding Normandy became impossible. German commanders in France, including Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who commanded German forces in the West, began warning Berlin that the situation was untenable. The Americans were advancing too quickly. German forces were being outmaneuvered and encircled. A tactical withdrawal to more defensible positions was necessary to avoid the destruction of entire armies. Hitler refused to authorize withdrawals. He ordered German forces to hold or counterattack, to regain the initiative, to throw the Americans back to the sea. These orders were militarily impossible given the changed tactical situation, but they remained in effect. German forces in Normandy would have to stand and fight in positions that were no longer defensible because of technology they had no effective counter to. This inflexibility at the strategic level, combined with the tactical advantage provided by Rhino tanks, would lead directly to the destruction of German forces in Normandy and the liberation of France. The timing of Rhino tank deployment was critical to one of the most important American operations of the Normandy campaign, Operation Cobra. This was planned as a major breakout offensive, using concentrated American forces to punch through German lines and exploit into the French interior. Bradley had been planning Cobra for weeks, but he had delayed launching it because he wasn't confident American armor could break through the blockage quickly enough to achieve the rapid exploitation the operation required. Rhino tanks changed his calculation. With modified Shermans able to break through hedgerows at will, Bradley believed Cobra could succeed. American armor would be able to exploit breakthroughs before Germans could seal them off, could move freely through the blockage instead of being channeled into defensive strongpoints, could maintain momentum through the initial German defensive belt and into open country beyond. Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944. After a massive aerial bombardment by over 1,100 American bombers, American ground forces attacked along a narrow front near the town of St. Lo. The plan called for infantry to break through the German main line of resistance, then for armored divisions to exploit the breach, driving deep into German rear areas before defenders could organize effective resistance. The initial attack faced strong German resistance. Despite the bombardment, German positions in the blockage were tough to eliminate completely. Infantry advances were slow and costly. For the first day, it seemed like Cobra might bog down like previous offensives had, making limited gains at high cost. But on July 26th, the second day of Cobra, American armor began breaking through. And here the Rhino tanks proved decisive. Instead of being channeled through narrow gaps that German forces could defend, the Rhino-equipped Shermans broke through hedgerows across a wide front. They created multiple penetrations faster than German forces could react to them. They turned the blockage, which should have slowed the advance, into terrain that favored the attacker by providing concealment and multiple routes of advance. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, both equipped with Rhino tanks, led the exploitation. They smashed through German positions, racing deeper into German-held territory. Behind them, infantry divisions followed, widening the breach and protecting the armored spearheads' flanks. The operation achieved the breakthrough Bradley had been seeking for 7 weeks. By July 30th, American forces had advanced over 20 miles from their start line, had broken through the entire German defensive system in the sector, and were exploiting into relatively open country beyond the blockage. The front had been torn open. German forces were retreating or being encircled. The stalemate was over. Without Rhino tanks, Cobra would likely have failed or made only limited gains. The blockage would have slowed the armored exploitation enough for German forces to establish new defensive lines and contain the breakthrough. The entire campaign might have bogged down for weeks or months more, with consequences for the broader war that are difficult to calculate. With Rhino tanks, Cobra succeeded spectacularly. The breakthrough led directly to the breakout from Normandy, the encirclement and destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket, and the rapid liberation of France in August and September 1944. These outcomes were made possible by a technical innovation invented by a sergeant using scrap materials and field-expedient manufacturing. The tactical impact of Rhino tanks extended beyond just breaking through hedgerows. The devices changed how American forces fought in multiple ways, some obvious, some subtle. First, Rhino tanks dramatically improved combined arms coordination between tanks and infantry. Before the cutters, tanks and infantry often became separated in the blockage. Tanks would take one route, infantry another, and coordination would break down. With Rhino tanks able to advance anywhere, tanks and infantry could operate together more closely. Tanks would break through hedgerows and suppress German positions, while infantry followed immediately behind, clearing positions that tanks couldn't reach and protecting tanks from German infantry with anti-tank weapons. Second, Rhino tanks allowed American forces to conduct more sophisticated maneuver warfare. Instead of frontal attacks along predictable axes, American commanders could now conduct flanking maneuvers, double envelopments, and other tactical movements that required cross-country mobility. German forces found themselves being outmaneuvered and cut off rather than just being pushed back slowly. Third, the cutters improved. American tank survivability significantly. Sherman tanks equipped with Rhinos rarely exposed their vulnerable belly armor, which had been a major cause of tank losses in the early blockage fighting. Tank crews felt much safer in rhinos because they could break through hedgerows without the extreme vulnerability of climbing over them. This improved morale and made tank crews more willing to take aggressive action. Fourth, rhino tanks changed the psychological balance in tank versus anti-tank combat. German anti-tank gunners had become confident fighting in the bocage because they could predict where American tanks would appear and set up ambushes accordingly. Rhino tanks disrupted these patterns, appearing from unexpected directions at unexpected times. German anti-tank crews became more cautious and less effective as their predictable targets became unpredictable threats. The cumulative effect of these changes was to restore American combat power to the levels that had been expected before the invasion. The bocage had degraded American effectiveness by perhaps 50% compared to open terrain. Rhino tanks eliminated most of that degradation, allowing American forces to fight at close to full capability even in difficult terrain. This had strategic implications beyond Normandy. The success of Rhino tanks demonstrated that American forces could adapt quickly to unexpected conditions, that American industrial and organizational capabilities could solve problems faster than enemies could exploit them, and that American tactical flexibility was a decisive advantage. The German military had prided itself on tactical excellence and adaptability. German forces had repeatedly demonstrated the ability to improvise solutions to tactical problems, to use terrain creatively, to achieve tactical superiority even when strategically overmatched. The bocage fighting seemed to confirm this, German forces using terrain to negate American material advantages. But the American response to the hedgerow problem demonstrated that adaptation and innovation weren't uniquely German capabilities. Americans could identify problems, develop solutions, and implement them at scale faster than Germans could respond. This was a strategic shock to German commanders who had assumed that German tactical skills would always give them an edge, even against larger and better equipped American forces. The rapid development and deployment of Rhino tanks also highlighted differences in organizational culture between American and German militaries. The American military, despite its bureaucracy and love of regulations, was actually quite good at bottom-up innovation. When a sergeant invented a better solution than the engineers, senior officers adopted it. When field commanders needed equipment modifications, maintenance units made them happen. The system was flexible enough to recognize good ideas regardless of their source and to implement them quickly. The German military, despite its reputation for tactical flexibility, was actually quite rigid in many ways. Innovation was expected to come from the top down, from educated officers and qualified engineers, not from enlisted men or junior officers in the field. Field expedient modifications were viewed with suspicion. The system prioritized formal authority over practical effectiveness. This cultural difference helped explain why the Germans never developed an effective counter to Rhino tanks. They could see that American tanks had been modified. They could observe the tactical effects. But they didn't develop their own equivalent innovation, whether a device to make their tanks equally mobile in bocage, or a tactical innovation to counter American mobility, or a new defensive system that negated the Rhino advantage. German forces continued fighting in Normandy using tactics that had worked before Rhino tanks appeared, failing to adapt to the changed tactical situation. This inflexibility, combined with Hitler's strategic inflexibility in refusing to authorize withdrawals, led to catastrophic German defeats in August 1944. The Falaise Pocket, where much of German Army Group B was encircled and destroyed in mid-August, was a direct result of mobility provided by Rhino tanks. American armored divisions, able to move quickly through both bocage and open country, conducted the sweeping maneuvers that closed the pocket. German forces, unable to retreat quickly enough and without the mobility to break out of the encirclement, were destroyed. Over 50,000 German soldiers were killed or captured in the Falaise Pocket. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and enormous quantities of supplies were lost. German combat power in France was effectively destroyed. The road to Paris and beyond was open. Rhino tanks didn't win the Battle of Normandy by themselves. Victory required courage from infantry attacking across fields under fire, skill from tank crews fighting at close range, leadership from officers at all levels, massive logistical efforts to keep forces supplied, air superiority that pounded German positions and interdicted reinforcements, and strategic vision from senior commanders planning operations. Thousands of Americans died in Normandy even after Rhino tanks were deployed. But Rhino tanks were the innovation that broke the tactical stalemate, that turned the bocage from an American problem into a German problem, that restored mobility and initiative to American forces. Without them, the Normandy campaign would have lasted longer, cost more lives, and possibly had a different outcome. With them, the campaign succeeded ahead of schedule and liberated France by early September. And this decisive innovation came not from the Ordnance Department or Army engineers or defense contractors, but from a cab driver from New York who became a sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division and who solved a problem by thinking practically about what would actually work. For Curtis Culin. Personally, the success of his invention brought recognition, but not necessarily reward. General Bradley personally thanked him and recommended him for decoration. Other senior officers praised his ingenuity and initiative. His fellow soldiers in the 2nd Armored Division treated him as a hero, the man who had given them the weapon that saved their lives. But the Army's promotion and award system wasn't really designed to recognize this kind of contribution. Culin had invented something, not done something in combat. He hadn't captured an enemy position or rescued wounded men under fire. He had thought of a good idea and built a prototype. That didn't fit neatly into the categories for which soldiers received medals or promotions. Culin was eventually awarded the Legion of Merit for his invention, a significant decoration, but not one of the Combat Valor Awards like the Silver Star or Distinguished Service Cross. He was promoted to technical sergeant, but he didn't become an officer, wasn't pulled out of his unit to work on other inventions, wasn't given any special recognition beyond the Legion of Merit and the knowledge that his invention had changed the course of the war. He continued serving with the 2nd Armored Division through the rest of the war, participating in the advance through France, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final campaigns in Germany. He survived the war, was discharged in 1945, and returned to civilian life in New York. After the war, Culin went back to driving a taxi. He had saved thousands of American lives and helped win the Battle of Normandy, but he still needed to make a living. Driving a cab was what he knew how to do, so that's what he did. He lived quietly, rarely spoke about his wartime service or his invention, and seemed content to return to obscurity. For decades, very few people knew that the cab driver who picked them up in New York had invented the device that broke the Normandy stalemate. Culin didn't talk about it, didn't seek recognition, didn't trade on his wartime accomplishments. He just went back to living an ordinary life. The hedgerow cutters themselves remained in use through the end of the war in Europe. After breaking out of Normandy, American forces faced different terrain that didn't require the cutters as much, but they remained installed on many tanks as general-purpose equipment. In the final campaigns in Germany, Rhino tanks proved useful for breaking through other types of obstacles. Hedgerows weren't unique to Normandy, and the cutters could tear through various types of vegetation and light obstacles. After the war, the hedgerow cutters were removed from most tanks and scrapped. They had been field-expedient devices, crudely welded, never intended as permanent installations. The steel was recycled, the tanks were refurbished to standard configuration, and the physical evidence of Culin's invention mostly disappeared. But the tactical lessons remained. The American military studied the hedgerow cutter experience as a case study in innovation, adaptation, and the importance of listening to soldiers in the field. Military schools taught the story of how a sergeant solved a problem that stumped engineers. The lesson was clear: good ideas can come from anywhere, and military organizations need to be flexible enough to recognize and implement them. The story of Curtis Culin and his hedgerow cutter raises profound questions about military innovation, organizational adaptability, and the nature of problem-solving in combat. To fully understand the significance of what Culin accomplished, we need to examine not just what he did, but why his success was remarkable, why the official system had failed, and what his invention reveals about warfare, technology, and human ingenuity. The failure of the Army's Ordnance Department and engineering establishment to solve the hedgerow problem before Culin did wasn't due to lack of effort, intelligence, or resources. The Army had some of the best engineers in America working on military problems, They had access to laboratories, testing facilities, and manufacturing capabilities. They approached problems systematically, with rigorous analysis and proper methodology. So why did they fail where a cab driver from New York succeeded? The answer reveals fundamental differences between academic engineering and practical problem solving, between theoretical analysis and hands-on experience. The Ordnance Department engineers approached the hedgerow problem from a theoretical perspective. They analyzed the physical properties of hedgerows, calculated the forces required to penetrate or destroy them, designed devices based on engineering principles and material science. Their solutions were sophisticated, carefully calculated, and properly engineered according to established principles. But their solutions didn't work as well as Culin's crude improvisation. The engineers had made several critical errors. First, they underestimated the physical toughness of Norman hedgerows. Laboratory tests on samples of hedge material didn't capture the reality of centuries-old root systems integrated into compacted earth embankments. The hedgerows were tougher than the engineers' calculations predicted. Second, the engineers designed devices that were too complex. They tried to create multifunction tools that could handle various situations, that were adjustable and sophisticated. But complexity added weight, created maintenance challenges, and introduced failure points. In combat conditions, simple and reliable beat sophisticated and fragile. Third, the engineers designed solutions that required special materials and precise manufacturing. This meant the devices had to be built in factories in England or the United States, then shipped to Normandy. The supply chain was slow and quantities were limited. Even if the engineered solutions had worked perfectly, there weren't enough of them and they couldn't be produced quickly enough. Culin succeeded because he approached the problem differently. He wasn't trying to design the optimal solution according to engineering principles. He was trying to create something that would actually work with the materials and manufacturing capabilities available in Normandy. His design was simple enough that any mechanic could build it, used materials that were lying around by the thousands of tons, and addressed the actual problem rather than an idealized version of it. This is the difference between engineering and tinkering. Engineers optimize. Tinkerers make things work. Both approaches have value, but in the chaos and urgency of combat, the ability to improvise practical solutions often matters more than the ability to design perfect ones. Culin's background as a cab driver gave him exactly the mindset needed. Driving a cab in 1930s New York required constant problem solving. Routes were blocked, traffic patterns changed, passengers wanted to go to difficult locations. A good cab driver learned to find creative solutions, to use what was available, to think practically rather than theoretically. Culin applied that same practical mindset to the hedgerow problem. He also benefited from being close to the actual problem. The Ordnance Department engineers were in England or the United States, working from reports and samples. Culin was in Normandy, seeing hedgerows every day, watching tanks try and fail to get through them, understanding viscerally what was needed. Proximity to the problem gave him insights that distant engineers couldn't match. The story of the hedgerow cutter also reveals important truths about military bureaucracy and institutional resistance to innovation. Bradley's decision to immediately adopt and scale Culin's invention was remarkable, precisely because it was so contrary to normal military practice. The Army had established systems for developing and fielding new equipment. Those systems existed for good reasons, to ensure quality, safety, and effectiveness, to prevent the adoption of poorly designed equipment that might fail in combat. But those systems were also slow and inflexible. Official weapons development took years. New equipment had to be designed, tested, approved, manufactured, and distributed through proper channels. The system worked well for long-term development, but was terrible at responding to urgent battlefield needs. Culin's invention bypassed all of that. It went from concept to prototype to widespread deployment in 6 weeks. This was only possible because Bradley was willing to violate established procedures, to accept risk, to prioritize speed over bureaucratic compliance. Many officers in his position would have insisted on proper testing and approval, even if it meant delaying deployment for months. Bradley understood that perfect solutions tomorrow were less valuable than good enough solutions today. This raises a broader question about military organizations. How do you Balance the need for standardization and quality control against the need for rapid innovation and adaptation. How do you create systems that are rigorous enough to prevent bad ideas from being implemented, but flexible enough to allow good ideas to emerge and spread quickly? The American military during World War II generally did well at this balance, better than most military organizations historically. The culture allowed for bottom-up innovation, field-expedient modifications, and rapid adoption of good ideas regardless of their source. But even in the American military, getting Culin's invention adopted required Bradley's personal intervention and willingness to override standard procedures. Other militaries struggled more with this balance. The German military, despite its reputation for tactical excellence, was often quite rigid about equipment and doctrine. Innovation was expected to come from the top, from qualified experts, not from sergeants in the field. The Soviet military was even more rigid, with devastating consequences when battlefield realities didn't match doctrinal assumptions. The Japanese military was perhaps the most rigid of all, with severe consequences for officers who deviated from established doctrine or questioned superior officers' decisions. This rigidity helped explain why Japanese forces often continued using tactics that weren't working, unable to adapt quickly to American innovations. The American military's comparative flexibility, its willingness to listen to sergeants with good ideas, was a significant advantage that contributed to ultimate victory. But it wasn't automatic or guaranteed. It required officers like Bradley who were secure enough to adopt ideas from subordinates, who cared more about effectiveness than about protecting their own authority or following proper channels. The technical impact of Rhino tanks on the Normandy campaign can be quantified to some extent through operational data. In the 6 weeks before Rhino tanks became widespread, from D-Day on June 6th to mid-July, American forces in Normandy advanced an average of about 1 mile per week while suffering approximately 30,000 casualties. Tank losses averaged about 50 per week, with many of those losses occurring during hedgerow fighting. In the 6 weeks after Rhino tanks became widespread, from mid-July to the end of August, American forces advanced an average of about 30 miles per week while suffering approximately 25,000 casualties, despite the much higher tempo of operations. Tank losses dropped to about 30 per week, even though tanks were engaging in far more combat and taking more risks. These numbers are approximate. Combat statistics from World War II were imprecise, and different sources give different figures, but the trends are clear. After Rhino tanks were deployed, American forces moved faster, advanced further, and took fewer casualties both absolutely and relative to the distance advanced. The devices had measurably improved American combat effectiveness. Tank crew survival rates improved even more dramatically. Before Rhino tanks, Sherman crews in the Bocage had life expectancies measured in days or weeks. Tanks were being knocked out faster than they could be replaced, and experienced crews were becoming rare. After Rhino tanks, crew survival rates increased significantly because tanks weren't exposing their belly armor and weren't getting stuck in vulnerable positions. This had a multiplier effect on combat effectiveness. Experienced tank crews were far more effective than green crews. They knew their equipment, worked together smoothly, understood tactics, and knew how to survive. By improving crew survival rates, Rhino tanks ensured that American armor became progressively more experienced and effective, rather than constantly recycling through inexperienced replacement crews. The psychological impact on both American and German forces is harder to quantify, but was arguably as important as the direct tactical effects. American morale improved significantly once Rhino tanks became available. Tank crews felt less like they were being sent to die in a meat grinder and more like they had the tools to win. Infantry felt better supported knowing that armor could actually reach and suppress German positions instead of getting stuck or destroyed trying to cross hedgerows. German morale declined correspondingly. The Bocage had been their greatest advantage, the terrain feature that allowed small numbers of German troops to hold off much larger American forces. When that advantage evaporated, when American tanks started breaking through hedgerows at will, German troops recognized that their situation was hopeless. The Americans had solved the problem that had been keeping them safe. Now it was only a matter of time before they were overrun. This psychological impact manifested in increased German surrender rates and decreased German combat effectiveness in the final weeks of the Normandy campaign. German units that would have fought stubbornly in early July were surrendering more readily in late July and August, not because they were less brave, but because they recognized the tactical situation was untenable. The broader strategic implications of Rhino tanks extended beyond Normandy. The success of the invasion and rapid liberation of France fundamentally changed the strategic situation in Europe. Germany had to fight on two major fronts, with Soviet forces advancing from the east and Allied forces advancing from the west. This two-front war stretched German resources beyond breaking point and made German defeat inevitable by late 1944. If the Normandy campaign had bogged down for months, if the blockage had continued to stall Allied advances, the strategic situation would have evolved differently. Germany would have had more time to build defenses, to develop new weapons like jet aircraft and advanced submarines, to potentially create conditions for a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. Rhino tanks helped ensure that the Normandy campaign succeeded on schedule, that France was liberated by September 1944, that Allied forces were positioned to invade Germany itself by early 1945. This timing mattered enormously for the final shape of the war and the post-war world. Some historians have argued that Culin's invention shortened the war in Europe by several months. This might seem like an exaggeration. How could a simple device have such large strategic effects? But the argument is defensible. The rapid conclusion of the Normandy campaign, enabled by Rhino tanks, set in motion a series of events that led directly to German defeat. The destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket removed much of Germany's combat power in France. The rapid Allied advance to the German border prevented Germany from establishing new defensive lines in France. The momentum of the summer 1944 offensive carried through into autumn and winter, keeping Germany on the defensive and preventing any hope of stabilizing the front. Without Rhino tanks, if the blockage fighting had continued through August and September with slow, costly advances, Germany might have had time to rush reinforcements to France, to establish new defensive positions, to potentially stabilize the front before winter. The war might have extended into 1946, with unknowable consequences for casualties and the post-war settlement. Of course, counterfactual history is inherently speculative. We can't know for certain what would have happened without Rhino tanks. But we can say with confidence that they significantly accelerated the Normandy campaign, that this acceleration had strategic consequences, and that Curtis Culin's invention therefore influenced the course of World War II in Europe. The human dimension of Culin's story deserves emphasis. This wasn't an abstract technical achievement. It was a human being recognizing a problem that was getting other human beings killed and feeling compelled to do something about it. Culin watched fellow soldiers die in Hedgerow fighting. He saw tanks burning with crews trapped inside. He experienced the frustration of having superior equipment rendered useless by terrain, and he decided to try to fix it. This sense of personal responsibility, this refusal to accept that nothing could be done, is at the heart of Culin's achievement. He could have assumed that solving the Hedgerow problem was someone else's job, that sergeants don't invent weapons, that the problem was too big for one person to address. Many people in his position did make those assumptions and waited for official solutions that came too slowly or didn't work. But Culin took personal responsibility. He thought about the problem, developed an idea, built a prototype, and pushed to get it tested and adopted. He didn't wait for permission or approval. He acted on his own initiative because the problem demanded action, and he had an idea that might work. This kind of initiative and personal responsibility is often what separates extraordinary from ordinary achievements. Culin wasn't smarter than the engineers, wasn't more qualified or educated, wasn't in a position of authority. He was just someone who saw a problem, thought of a solution, and refused to accept reasons why it couldn't be done. The recognition Culin received during and after the war was substantial, but incomplete. He got the Legion of Merit, which was appropriate recognition for his contribution. But he wasn't promoted to officer, wasn't pulled out of his unit to work on other innovations, wasn't given any special position or responsibility based on his demonstrated ingenuity. Part of this was the Army's rigid class structure. Culin was enlisted, had no college education, and didn't fit the officer profile. The Army of the 1940s had strict boundaries between enlisted and officers, and crossing those boundaries was difficult, regardless of demonstrated capability. An enlisted man who invented something important might get a medal, but wouldn't be commissioned unless he went through officer candidate school like everyone else. Part of it was also Culin's own personality and preferences. By all accounts, he wasn't someone who sought recognition or advancement. He had done his job, solved a problem, and was content to return to his regular duties. He didn't push for promotion or special assignments. He just wanted to get through the war and go home. After the war, Culin received no pension or special benefits for his invention. The Army owned any innovations created by soldiers, and there was no provision for compensating inventors beyond normal military pay and awards. Culin returned to civilian life with his discharge pay, his medals, and the knowledge that he had saved thousands of lives, but he didn't become wealthy or famous from his invention. This was perhaps unfair, but reflected the reality that soldiers were expected to serve without expectation of personal gain beyond their pay and benefits. Culin had been doing his duty as he saw it. The Army had recognized that duty with a decoration. That was considered sufficient. In the decades after the war, as historians began examining the Normandy campaign in detail, Culin's contribution received increasing recognition. Books and documentaries about D-Day and the Bocage fighting almost always mentioned the hedgerow cutter and its inventor. Military historians identified Culin's invention as one of the critical innovations that enabled Allied victory in Normandy. But recognition from historians didn't translate into fame or fortune for Culin himself. He continued living quietly in New York, driving his cab, rarely speaking about his wartime service. When historians or journalists tracked him down for interviews, he was modest and brief. He had done what needed doing, he would say. Plenty of other guys did more important things. The attention made him uncomfortable. Curtis Culin died in 1963 at the age of 48, relatively young, possibly from health issues related to his wartime service, though records are unclear. His obituary in the New York Times was brief, mentioning his wartime service and invention, but providing few details. Most New Yorkers who read that obituary had no idea that the cab driver who had died had invented the device that broke the Normandy stalemate. The hedgerow cutter itself has been preserved and honored in various ways. Examples of rhino tanks with Culin cutters installed are displayed in military museums in the United States and France. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has a Sherman tank with an original hedgerow cutter, explaining its significance to visitors. The Musée du Débarquement in Normandy has similar displays, ensuring that French visitors understand how this American innovation helped liberate their country. In Normandy itself, where the bocage still exists much as it did in 1944, there are memorials to the American soldiers who fought there. Some of these memorials specifically mention the hedgerow cutter and Curtis Culin, recognizing the invention that transformed the campaign. French civilians in Normandy understand that the rapid liberation of their region was made possible by this innovation. The U.S. Army has used Culin's story in training and education programs. At command and staff colleges, the hedgerow cutter is taught as a case study in innovation, adaptation, and leadership. The lessons emphasized are that good ideas can come from anywhere, that leaders need to be flexible enough to recognize and adopt them, and that simple solutions are often better than sophisticated ones. The story is also used in courses on military problem-solving and innovation. Students are asked what lessons can be drawn from the hedgerow cutter experience, what it reveals about organizational culture and innovation, why the official system failed while a sergeant succeeded. These discussions help develop officers who understand that their job isn't just to follow doctrine, but to adapt and innovate when situations demand it. In recent decades, as the military has focused more on rapid adaptation and innovation, Culin's story has been invoked frequently. The term Culin moment has entered military jargon, referring to innovations that emerge from soldiers in the field solving immediate tactical problems. Commanders are encouraged to create conditions that enable Culin moments, to empower soldiers to innovate, to reduce bureaucratic barriers to rapid adoption of good ideas. This represents a significant evolution in military culture. The modern military recognizes explicitly that innovation should be encouraged at all levels, that soldiers closest to problems often have the best ideas for solving them, and that organizational flexibility and rapid adaptation are force multipliers as important as weapons and equipment. But creating a culture that enables Culin moments is difficult. It requires leaders who are secure enough to accept ideas from subordinates, who care more about effectiveness than about following proper procedures, who are willing to take risks on unproven innovations. It requires organizations that can distinguish between good ideas that should be adopted quickly and bad ideas that would be dangerous or wasteful. It requires balance between standardization and improvisation, between quality control and innovation. The American military has sometimes succeeded at this balance and sometimes failed. In recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, there have been examples of successful field innovations, such as soldiers developing improvised protection against roadside bombs or creating new tactics for counterinsurgency operations. But there have also been examples where good ideas were slow to be adopted or where bureaucracy prevented innovation from spreading. The tension between institutional processes and field innovation remains, just as it did in 1944. The difference is that the modern military is more consciously aware of this tension and more deliberately trying to manage it. Culin's story provides both inspiration and cautionary tale, showing what's possible when the system works, but also highlighting how close his invention came to being ignored or rejected. The technical legacy of Culin's hedgerow cutter extends beyond World War II. The principle behind it, using steel prongs to tear through obstacles rather than trying to push through or climb over, influenced later military engineering. Modern combat engineering equipment uses similar concepts, mechanical devices that penetrate and destroy obstacles rather than trying to overcome them through force alone. Mine clearing equipment, for example, often uses arrays of prongs or flails that penetrate ground and detonate mines or tear them loose. Obstacle clearing systems use mechanical force focused through rigid structures to breach barriers. While these modern systems are far more sophisticated than Culin's crude welded steel prongs, they operate on the same basic principle he discovered, that concentrated force applied through rigid structures can overcome obstacles that resist distributed force. The hedgerow cutter also influenced tank design philosophy more broadly. Tank designers recognized that tanks needed to be adaptable, able to mount specialized equipment for different types of terrain and obstacles. Modern tanks have standardized mounting points for various types of equipment, from mine plows to dozer blades to bridge layers. This modularity, this recognition that tanks should be adaptable platforms rather than single-purpose vehicles, was influenced partly by the hedgerow cutter experience. The rapid field modification of tanks during the Normandy campaign also demonstrated the importance of maintainability and the ability to modify equipment in field conditions. Modern military equipment is designed with this in mind, with modular components that can be replaced or upgraded by maintenance units, with interfaces that allow for the addition of new capabilities. The days of equipment being sacrosanct, unable to be modified without manufacturer involvement, are largely gone. Culin's innovation helped establish the principle that equipment should be adaptable by the soldiers using it. Perhaps the most important legacy of Curtis Culin and his hedgerow cutter isn't technical, but cultural. The story has become part of American military mythology, a tale that exemplifies values the military wants to promote: innovation, initiative, practical problem solving, and the recognition that rank and credentials don't determine who has good ideas. The story is told to new soldiers, included in training curricula, referenced in leadership courses, because it communicates important messages about what kind of military organization America wants to have. Not one where innovation only comes from the top, where soldiers wait for orders and solutions from superiors, where field experience is devalued compared to technical credentials, but rather one where every soldier is empowered to think, to identify problems and propose solutions, where good ideas are recognized and adopted regardless of their source. This cultural ideal isn't always achieved in practice. Military organizations are necessarily hierarchical and bureaucratic, and those characteristics can stifle innovation as easily as enable it. But having the ideal, having stories like Culin's that exemplify it, helps keep the organization oriented toward flexibility and adaptation rather than rigid adherence to established procedures. For Curtis Culin himself, the legacy was probably both a source of pride and a burden. Pride because he had accomplished something significant, had saved lives, had influenced the course of history. But also a burden because he became defined by that one achievement, because people who learned about his invention couldn't understand why he went back to driving a cab, why he didn't leverage his fame into something more. But Culin was content with his choices. He had done what needed doing when it needed doing. That was enough. He didn't need fame or fortune or special recognition. He had been a soldier who saw a problem and fixed it. Then he went back to being a regular person living a regular life. That was his choice, and he was comfortable with it. In the end, Curtis Culin's story is about the extraordinary potential of ordinary people. He wasn't a genius, wasn't specially trained, wasn't in a position of authority. He was a cab driver from New York who became a sergeant in an armored division and who happened to think of a good solution to a difficult problem. But that good solution changed the course of the Normandy campaign, broke a stalemate that was costing thousands of lives, and helped ensure the rapid liberation of France. The impact of his invention was strategic, affecting the outcome of battles and campaigns, shortening the war, saving countless lives. This is the power of human ingenuity and initiative. One person with a practical mind and the determination to act can change history. Culin didn't have advantages of education or position. He had curiosity, practical intelligence, and the refusal to accept that nothing could be done about a problem that was killing his fellow soldiers. The Hedgerow cutters welded onto thousands of Sherman tanks in Normandy in summer 1944 were crude devices, field-expedient modifications that no engineer would have been proud of. They were ugly, they were simple, they were made from scrap materials by mechanics with limited training. But they worked. They solved a problem that sophisticated engineering had failed to solve. They broke a tactical stalemate and enabled strategic victory. They demonstrated that war isn't just about having the best equipment or the most resources, it's also about the ability to adapt, to innovate, to recognize problems and fix them. The thunder of rhino tanks breaking through Norman hedgerows in July and August 1944, the sound of steel prongs tearing through centuries-old embankments, the sight of Sherman tanks bursting through obstacles that should have stopped them, these represented more than just tactical success. They represented the triumph of practical problem-solving over theoretical analysis, of field innovation over bureaucratic process, of a sergeant's ingenuity over a problem that had stumped experts. Curtis Culin gave the Allies the weapon that saved D-Day, not a sophisticated guided missile or a secret wonder weapon, but steel prongs welded to the front of tanks. Simple, crude, effective. Like the man who invented it, the device was practical, unpretentious, and absolutely effective at doing what needed to be done. The blockage of Normandy, which should have been an impenetrable defensive barrier, became instead a graveyard for German forces who had relied on it. The hedgerows that were supposed to stop the Allies were torn apart by devices invented by a cab driver and built by mechanics using scrap metal. That is the story of Curtis Culin and the invention that changed the war. A story of ingenuity, initiative, and the extraordinary achievements of ordinary people who refuse to accept that problems can't be solved. A story that deserves to be remembered and told, to inspire others to think practically, to act decisively, to never accept that nothing can be done. The sergeant who saved D-Day did it with a welding torch, some scrap steel, and the determination to fix a problem that was getting Americans killed. That was enough. It was more than enough. It changed the world. In the fields and hedgerows of Normandy, where the blockage still stands as it has for centuries, you can imagine the ghosts of rhino tanks breaking through, steel prongs tearing through ancient embankments, opening the way for the liberation of France. The land that was a killing ground became a pathway to freedom because one man refused to accept that the problem couldn't be solved. Curtis Culin, cab driver from New York, sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division, inventor of the device that broke the Normandy stalemate, an ordinary man who did an extraordinary thing, A soldier who saved D-Day with simplicity, ingenuity, and the refusal to accept that nothing could be done. That is his legacy. That is why his story matters. That is why decades after his death, we remember the sergeant who invented the weapon that changed the war and helped save the world.